I love the way that it gets right to the heart of what it means to be human. I mean, the things that we all share, we're all afraid of, we all want to survive. We want our families to be free from monsters, so it's a great way of communalizing humanity, if that is even a word.
What initially drew you to horror, even as just a fan of it?
I say this, and it's true, I was weaned on it. And I remember my mother was an English teacher, and she loved, we had classic horror. We had Shelley, and she kept Stephen King. I remember her reading Stephen King when I was a little kid and looking at the scary covers. And then I would bring those books to school thinking, even though I hadn't read it yet, thinking that everybody looked to me to say, well, what's the newest horror that's out? So my parents let me watch way too much horror, things I should not have been seeing so young, but it was interesting because there were different kinds of people. There were outcasts, there were women. We watched horror from different parts of the world. So it kind of opened up new horizons for me in a lot of different ways.
I feel like every horror fan I've ever spoken to, we all kind of have that mutual, I was way too young when I watched this, but then it ends up becoming something formative for us and kind of shapes the way we look at things. Why is it a genre that you love for delivering messaging?
I describe it as kind of being able to Trojan horse discussions about the kind of issues that I like to talk about, which is usually social issues, issues surrounding marginalized people. It's a way for us to examine our fears and our hopes, and it lets you just turn the box over and look at everything from a different perspective. And so I love the way that it gets right to the heart of what it means to be human. I mean, the things that we all share, we're all afraid of, we all want to survive. We want our families to be free from monsters, so it's a great way of communalizing humanity, if that is even a word. So it also allows you to take a kind of more voracious approach to some issues and points of view that you're not really allowed to so much in dramas.
Speaking of cracking it open in a unique way, two-sentence horror stories is such a fun concept. I wanted to ask, I watched the trailer for Quota. Where did you pull inspiration for what you wrote for Quota? And if you could tell me a little bit more about that.
Quota I wrote before COVID hit, before we knew about COVID. We were in the room and the idea was thrown out, what about a shipping company and people trapped? And it just grew from there. We did research on various companies where people had been, there was a man who was dead in a shipping company and nobody knew it. And then the company tried to blame the person for having died. And I just said, I like to fight for the underdog, and I write a lot about people who are fighting for their rights. So for me, it seemed like a perfect kind of story to dive into that. After I finished writing the draft of the episode, we became aware of COVID and how bad it was. And the episode kind of leans in a little bit into a kind of infection. So I was terrified. I was like, we can't do this episode. We just can't. It's just too weird. It's too uncanny. There are too many people that are dying from COVID. We can't do this. And then we realized that the message of it, especially as really eerie things started happening where shipping companies people were getting sick from COVID because they were working. And so we said, no, we have to do it.
What were some underdogs in horror that really, whether it be just inspired you or maybe you even saw a little bit of yourself in?
Well, this will seem like a weird one, though I do have a horror comedy that I'm directing soon, but People Under the Stairs, that's one of those movies where I think about that young Black kid and what it says about race. That stands out to me. Also, one of my favorite films, because I do like to write about politics, is Pan's Labyrinth, and that little girl and how she has to deal with all kinds of levels of horror, and the outside horror, the political horror impacts her as much as anything else and her family. The Babadook, because I'm a mom, and so the Babadook absolutely hit a nerve in so many ways. And I think that's the great thing about horror, is that it really is about the characters. For me, the best horror, the characters are compelling, they're very relatable, and you're going on this journey with them. And they tap into the things that you are afraid of, the things that you think about. You know, as a woman, as a Black person, and as a mom, those are like kind of things that stand out.
Specifically, are there any women in horror that do you feel maybe influenced, whether it be your writing or your directing style?
Jennifer Kent, Karen Kusama. I guess it's a form of horror, but Reed Morano's work on The Handmaid's Tale, she's a cinematographer first. And I've always been drawn to, I don't like to call it elevated horror. It's not that. It's that horror can be beautiful. It can be shot beautifully. So I really appreciate the work that Reed brings to her genre work. And Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, I've seen that film several times. It's so many different levels that it plays on. But if you just watch it for production design and the palette and what the lead character wears throughout the film, what happens in the background in terms of color schemes and what she's playing with, all of that influences me, because that visual aspect is so cool. And then I haven't seen it yet, but I'm looking forward to Nia DaCosta's Candyman.
Oh my God.
That I cannot wait. So yeah.
I really do love specifically why she pushed it in terms of the communal experience when it comes to movie watching and horror movies.
Yes, absolutely. And I was disappointed at first, because I was like, oh man, I wanted to stream it. Am I going to get to the theaters? And I'm like, no, she's right. Because when I saw Get Out, I mean, I love the call and response. People say, oh, they're talking in the movies. No, it's call and response. And it's a form. I don't know if anybody, I guess they do talk about it sometimes, but it is definitely a form of film watching, where people talk back at the screen, and it makes it so much more fun.
I know you, I believe, founded Nick's Horror Collective.
Yes, I did.
Yes.
Along with Kelly Krause, who's a great friend. It's a collective of women horror writers and filmmakers. Kelly was amplifying women horror writers on Twitter, and so I reached out to her. I said, "This is great, and thank you for including me. And I would love to start a group of women filmmakers and writers who create content. So it's not just about, it's great that we're supporting each other, but let's take it a step further. Let's actually create work together." So we started it. I can't quite announce it yet, but there's a major, we're going to be launching some major initiatives with a partnership with a major horror platform. And I'm very, very excited about that. And we've developed a podcast as well. And we have a great group of women who do amazing work. We also do something called Nick's Live, and we interview women in horror. And our last one was with Sarah Bennett, who's the VFX supervisor, who's won an Academy Award for Ex Machina. She worked on Annihilation, which I loved.
Oh my God.
So
that bear.
Yes, that bear. We're, tapping into a world that's already there. And it was like 2 years ago, I was on a flight to LA, where I live now, but at the time I was in New York, and I was in the HBO writing fellowship and flying back and forth. Jason Blum had said, well, women don't really, don't like horror. And by the time I landed in LA, there was this article that listed me as one of the women horror directors they should consider. And I'd only did a short film, so I really don't think I should have been on the list, but that really knocked me in the head, that there's this idea that there aren't that many women out there who like horror, when we're over 50% of the audience, and that there aren't women who make horror, that want to direct horror, write horror. We're out there in droves. So this is just a way to create. There are other groups like Nick's Horror Collective. We're not the only one out there, but I think the more the merrier. And I would love to support the other groups that are out there too. I think it's we should just all help each other out.
Why do you feel women are so drawn to the genre?
I think because, maybe it's a great question. I think maybe because a lot of our fears are often not addressed, and a lot of our stresses are minimized. It's a cathartic way for us to deal with that. I was on a a clubhouse with director Tonya Pinkins, who's directed this short film called Red Pill, which I can't wait to see. And we were all talking about how, since we were kids and even now, how it's a relief sometimes to watch a horror film, that it is, and how cathartic it is. So I think for women, I think it functions for many women in that way. And that's part of what I want Nick's Horror Collective to do as well, is to kind of educate about the history of women in horror, because it is a new thing. You know, we've been out here doing this sometimes unheralded, and we have to know our own history. So I think it's that's a big part of it as well.
I actually want to dive a little bit deeper on that, because I feel like it's almost every woman's one woman mission to educate on that, because it is astounding how many women in horror haven't been given their flowers, how many people remove Deborah Hill from Halloween, how many people act like Mary Lambert never happened, or just how many women directed the slasher boom. What are some women that you feel like just haven't been given their flowers when it comes to the history of genre?
I'm gonna have to dig in my head. I'm going to say, actually, the women who were working, I mean, there were women in the past, but I feel like there are women who are working in other countries. Revenge, the French film.
Yes, I remember watching Revenge last year and realizing that this was a perspective and a gaze that I had not been given.
Yes. So there are women working in corners of the world that are not being heralded. And last year we had more women directors directing films and horror films, but many of them weren't promoted. The marketing they're behind them. So, and sometimes this is going to sound like a cop out a little bit, but sometimes it's like when someone asks you on Twitter, they ask you, well, tell me what that is, and give me the link to that. And I'm like, do your own damn research. I want to say to people, you know what? Start just Google women horror directors and look who comes up. And Amanpour is someone who, Liliane Amanpour, she was a big thing when she first hit. And then, where are the second and third films from these women? I think that's the crux of what I would ask, is say, look at the first films of women horror writers, and let's make sure that, and horror directors, and let's make sure that there's a second and a third, so that this idea of the one-hit wonders, like we gave her a chance. Well, let's keep giving new women the chance, but we also need to allow these women to develop a body of work, because that's how you become a better director. And I'm always saying this, but men who direct films that don't do so well, they fail up to direct other films. And so all of these women we're talking about, I mean, Jennifer Kent has had a chance to direct more films. Karen, of course, has some amazing work coming up. Frankenstein Project, I understand. So that's part of the picture as well, is us seeking out what isn't on just the top 10 list, but really digging in and finding those women who are creating on the outer edges and need their way into the mainstream.
What do you personally find very scary in horror? Like, what's the subgenres that typically get you?
Two things: mirrors and Ouija boards. I will not watch. I have not, even though everybody tells me you should see it, it's so good. I can't watch Ouija board, because I've actually had a run-in with Ouija boards and been on a flight that went very badly.
Oh my God.
It just gives me chills even to think about it. So I don't do Ouija board films, and mirrors have always got, it took me a long time to see mirror horror movies. It takes me a while.
Hopefully this summer you're directing your first feature film, All the People I Like Are Dead. Tell me a little bit about that project.
It's funny because it's really bookmarked, kind of interesting that it's, we're slated, all things working out with COVID. We're supposed to be shooting in Manitoba, so we're doing a Canadian shoot. But I wrote that script when coming out of when Trump won the election. And I don't know if many people remember, but in 2016, leading up to that, we had scores of people, like beloved people, who were dying. Prince, there was just it was one after the other, and my mother died as well, so it was just a crush. And then he won, so it was crushing in all ways. And that's how that story came to me, is that what if you could bring back the people that you really loved and liked? So it's kind of different version of what we think of with zombie, and then what if it backfires on the person who tries to do that? And so it's a kind of a very dark horror comedy. It has a very multi-ethnic cast, and it's about people who are outcasts and people who try to save themselves. So it's out there. It's very bizarre, but it's fun. And it's one of the few scripts that I wrote is the quickest script I've ever written, and the one that the producer is like, it didn't have to change very much. And I've never written a horror comedy before, so it'll be interesting.
Is there a reason why you feel like horror and comedy might be a very good matchup for each other?
Yes, but I also think it's really difficult to pull off, and I'm not assuming that. Until I get the film directed and someone told me it worked, it's really hard. And the director at Better Watch Out was kind of giving me some pointers, and you really have to make sure that you're finding the drama in the comedy and the kind of the comedy and the horror. And the relief of tension is what works. So the comedy gives you that relief. So I think they work well in that way, and the way in which they are both disarming. I mean, you get frightened and laugh. They both catch you by surprise. So I think they work well that way. But I think tone is really an issue when in any film you're directing, and it's really difficult when you're marrying horror and comedy. So it'll be a real challenge, but I'm looking forward to it.
What was a formative moment for you when you realized that you wanted to work in this media? I
started as a playwright. And so I was in New York. I as a writer, I was writing these stories about the early labor movement and the KKK. And then I wrote a play about the genocide in Rwanda, and they were being developed by New York Stage and Film. And I had written a number of other plays, one about a short play about a woman who touches antiques and she can see how they're connected to slaves or to Black people in the past. And somebody pointed out to me, they said, every single play you've written is a ghost story. And I was like, no, it's not. And then I looked at them all, and they were. They all had hauntings in them, and they all had ghosts and that kind of perspective. So it kind of hit me that, and I was already a huge horror fan, that my way into stories is from that perspective, and why fight it? So I decided to dive in and started writing. The Rwanda play was seen by a film director who invited me out to LA and suggested that I start writing TV and film because I was a very visual writer, and dive into both sci-fi and horror because I love both. Just seemed to make sense to me, and I haven't looked back.
Is there anything specifically about the TV medium, the short form medium, versus a feature-length form that appeals to you for writing a scary story?
Well, yeah, and two-sentence horror stories is super short form. It's half an hour. I love anthologies. I love the fact that it's like, short television and horror is like sitting around the campfire. We tell all these different stories, these scary stories. So that's how I feel about that, and I really love that. And I love, the TV is so amazing now in the quality of the people that you're working with, and it's a quicker turnaround, and it allows you to play a little bit more for that reason. So I think it's a great medium for horror for that. Film lags behind TV in terms of having more BIPOC creatives involved, and the stories that it tells. When you look at Lovecraft Country, when you look at Watchmen, when you look at all the different kind of stories that are told on television compared to what trickles up to film, it's interesting. So that's changing, but I think you can really lean into more political stories and stories that are more relevant on television.
What is your favorite final girl?
Oh, I know, though I don't know if we're going to consider it really, I guess it is kind of horror. the old guard, the women, both her and the young Black girl who's her protege. That's kind of like, I loved that you had these two powerful women in that story. I also happen to love Gina Prince Bythewood, who's an amazing director and has been very, very generous and kind in giving me advice. So the Old Guard is a story that's probably more sci-fi, but things kind of blend for me. I kind of go, it's kind of comes into the same world, even though they're different.
Thank you so much for your time today. I very much appreciate it. This has been so illuminating, so lovely.
Oh, it's fun. Thanks for having me.